Welcome, everyone. My name is Catherine Snow. I'm at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and it is my great pleasure today to introduce this session, which we have constructed to be a little bit of a deviation, we hope in the positive direction, from the normal structure, because there is a very dynamic opportunity, nurtured in part through the history of relationships established within ProLier, to demonstrate how collaborative work can get done across countries and across languages. So that the three presenters today are all working on the same major issues, and they've worked together and learned from each other, but they are also going to present three separate bodies of work, each of them quite efficiently and briefly, so that there's lots of time for questions. So the three panelists are Paolo Uchelli, who is my colleague here at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Paola's original training, her background training, was in linguistics, but then she went on and has gone on to study over the last 20 years or so sociocultural and individual differences in language and how that relates to literacy development. And she currently is looking at students' writing outcomes and considering predictors from language skills in elementary and middle school. And she does this work with monolingual speakers of English and multilingual speakers and writers as well. The second speaker will be Beatrice Cardoso, who has a PhD in education from the University of São Paulo in Brazil, and she's been working in the field of promoting the quality of teaching and learning in public schools for a long time, longer than you would expect given how young she looks. She has founded two organizations that have had as their goal improving the culture and practice of instruction. We got to know Beatrice when she was a fellow in 2013 at Harvard's Advanced Leadership Initiative. And since 2019, she's the co-principal investigator and member of the Language for Learning research team at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, the team that Paola leads. And Alejandra Meneses, the third speaker, is an associate professor in the Faculty of Education at Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile. Her research, also focuses on language development across the school years and its relationships to literacy and learning. She views teachers as agents of change. We've also had the pleasure of hosting Alejandra at Harvard various times. And she sent me a very modest and short bio, so I'm just going to put into chat a couple of links to works that she has published recently. But all three of these scholars have worked together and learned from each other, and I think today we will have a wonderful chance to learn from them all. So the plan of action is that I will ask Paola a question, which she will answer. I haven't told her what the question is, but I guess she could probably guess what the question is. And she will then take 20 minutes to answer that question, and we'll pass it on to Beatrice with another question. So it's a modified, extended interview model. And after Beatrice passes the word to Alejandra, then you will have a chance to ask questions. In the meantime, if you want to put questions in chat, you should feel free to do that. We won't answer them along the way unless they are crucial and urgent, but I will kind of try to curate them and make sure that they all get answered by the end of the 90 minutes this morning. So Paola, I want to ask you the question of basically, What is it about language that is most crucially related to literacy outcomes, reading and writing outcomes? And why is it that although language acquisition is universal, there is so much individual difference and socioculturally correlated sources of difference in literacy outcomes? And can that be explained by thinking about the language skills that children in different families or in different social circumstances have been able to develop?
Okay, great, Catherine. Thank you so much. And I will try to answer that question in the next few minutes in multiple ways. And I should just warn everybody that this is more of a descriptive research program than an explanatory one, but we're gonna think about particular language skills that are supportive of reading and writing at school. And just to build on what Catherine was saying, what we have investigated now for, yes, 2 decades perhaps, is the language that is supportive of school learning, particularly literacy and writing. And truly, I can, based on the research that we ourselves, Ale, Beatrice, many more in the field have collected, we can say that language is key to achieve excellence and equity in education. In other words, if we don't understand and if we don't address the immense variability that kids in language skills that kids bring to school, and if we don't pay attention to the language that is particularly helpful for reading and writing and learning at school, schools will be either reproducing or even exacerbating the inequalities that exist in the larger society. So the panel that you will, in which you are participating today, is focused on this particular issue. And what we have tried to organize for you is to summarize basically more than a decade of work that we have conducted together, and in part supported actually by this pro-learn community that brought us together in multiple occasions. So what we have done, we started with this question of what are the language skills that support reading comprehension and writing by doing research in the United States in English. But then we moved that, and that inspired another initiative that took place in Chile under the leadership of Alejandra Meneses, and we translated and adapted and reimagined the construct and the instrument in Chile with local students that now have been that work has been expanded to Mexico by Silvia Meneses, to many others in different Latin American countries. And then actually the English work and the Spanish work inspired the Portuguese work that Beatrice led in Brazil, and we produced also a Portuguese CALS construct and instrument. Beautifully, now, of course, we are taking those instruments also back to the US, where we are testing bilingual kids who are Spanish English bilinguals and Portuguese English bilinguals with the instruments that we have developed in collaboration with Ale and Beatrice. And so the way we've organized this panel is, first, I'm going to focus on which language resources support reading and writing at school. And this is basically the CALS research. I'm going to give you the basics of that. And I know some of you know more about this research. Some of you might not know anything about this research. And so this first part might be a little bit familiar for some of you. And this is going to be basically the research that we conducted in English first, but then in Spanish under the leadership of Ale, and in Portuguese under the leadership of Beatrice. But what we're going to do then is I'm going to do this first introduction of what are CALS, why are they important, to answer the question that Catherine just posed. And then actually, the most interesting part of this panel will be how to think about the types of interventions that will translate that work into action. And in that way, you're going to listen from Beatrice about an intervention on history and language, working with teachers to prepare them in upper elementary school classrooms in Brazil, in Sao Paulo, and then from Ale on a science and history intervention in 4th grade in Chile. And this work is in some ways informed by the CALS, but goes way beyond. So I'm so excited to hear about the progress that they have made recently on this work. But first, let's start by why so many students do not understand the texts they read at school. This is truly the problem that drives the work that Ale, Beatrice, and I are presenting today. And if we remember, some of you might have been with us last year when Jaime Saavedra shared with us this learning poverty index, the fact that today in low and middle income countries, 53% of children at age 10 cannot understand a simple text. His estimate was that this would go up 63% after the pandemic. And so this is what Saavedra calls a moral crisis. And we need to think about ways to support kids, not only in low and middle income countries. Actually, in the US, more than half of kids in 4th and 8th grade do not achieve the proficiency levels expected. So in educational systems that are more linguistically and socioeconomically diverse than ever before because of global migration, because of expansion of school enrollment, and in a world where more advanced literacy skills are necessary in all realms of life, civically, politically, education, career-wise, we still see enormous inequities. And so how can we support schools to better prepare kids with those advanced language and literacy skills is again the goal that drives us. And so what, very, very briefly, and at the risk of high simplification, what have we learned from prior interventions? Well, we know word recognition skills, right? Understanding how to support kids to decode fluently, to read fluently, reading comprehension strategies like predicting, summarizing, and vocabulary interventions all have been tried in the field. And what we have learned is that these are all important skills. We all need to focus on those skills, but these are insufficient. We still cannot move the needle on reading comprehension for upper elementary and middle school kids. Now, more recently, we've learned that discussion approaches, the discussion of text, of controversial ideas, improves reading comprehension. And so this is now where we are working in this realm of understanding now, how can we leverage discussion-based approaches in even more effective ways? And why? Why would be the discussion of texts supportive of reading comprehension, or the discussion of ideas? Some people do not necessarily make the connection between the oral language and text comprehension. But let me just share quickly that what happens if you think about language, when we think about emotions, when we think about reasoning, when we think about others' perspective, and when we think about how minds comprehend text, all of that is inaccessible. That's not directly observable for kids. That all happens inside the mind, and kids do not have direct access to those processes. So when we think about language, when we think about communication and extended talk, language is making all these processes that are otherwise hidden accessible to kids. It is in discussing ideas, it is in naming emotions and understanding perspectives through language that kids can sort of have a window into those processes, right? And that's the importance of these discussion-based approaches. We also know from the field that children learn language by producing language. That is the main mechanism, right? Not silently waiting in classrooms and just listening to teachers. We also know that there's no way to build new language if you don't build it on the language that you know. That's a general principle for all knowledge. We have to expand, welcome the languages that kids bring, and that kids learn language by trying to connect with others socially and by trying to communicate new ideas that they care about. for which they will need new language, right? It is exactly in that process of little kids when they're trying to tell a story and they don't have the means to communicate that parents would help. And that's the process of language learning. So in a sense, at school, we need to welcome and leverage all the languages that children bring, and we need to build on those to expand the language resources to support the learning of demanding content, right? But what we know is exactly as I'm saying, through the dialogue, children learn to talk, but also learn to understand emotions, reasoning, perspectives, and to understand text. And yet, what we know is that large proportions of students, even through adolescence, face difficulties to understand the language of texts. But what we haven't been that clear in the last years is which core language skills, beyond just vocabulary, beyond isolated word meanings, are helpful to explain what language skills my kids still need to learn in order to understand text, and what language skills that we can identify might be helpful in better understanding why they are having challenges with text. So to go back to Catherine's question, why do we need to focus on language, and why might language and which language might be the most helpful in thinking about this complex problem? What happens, think about your own life, even if you speak supposedly a single language. As you communicate in different communities, there are different discussions, different language, different structures and words that you use. And what happens is that because you increasingly navigate more contexts and more communities, your language continues to expand. And it certainly experiences a potential huge expansion throughout the middle school years and secondary school, and of course, potentially throughout life. But what is very interesting also is that even if we are skilled in one community, we might not be skilled in another community. In a way, we don't learn English or Spanish or Portuguese. We learn ways of using English or ways of using Spanish or Portuguese in particular contexts. And so the work that we do, of course, focuses in the school context. What is the language that kids might need in the school context that they might or might not learn in other contexts? And so this is what the work of the CALS research, the core analytical language skills research, focuses on. And the basic simple idea is that as students bring their own everyday informal knowledge to school, they need to learn scientific understandings, disciplinary understandings that expand their understanding of the world. And in similar ways, students bring their more conversational language, but the disciplinary texts that they encounter contain more information-dense language that they might or might not know from their experiences outside of school. So this is the hypothesis that drives this work, is that there are these core analytical language skills, these language skills that correspond to the features that are very common in disciplinary text, what I call analytical text, sort of informational, explanatory, argumentative text in science, in history, and that these skills, these language skills that are so common across disciplines might actually be challenging for many kids and might actually help explain why they have difficulty understanding content area texts. Okay, so the hypothesis specifically was that we would find individual differences in this set of high utility language skills, and that those differences would help explain why kids have difficulties in reading comprehension. But what are these, which are these language skills? We worked, tremendously hard to gather all the research, to examine assessments and curricula, to talk to kids and teachers. And these are the features that we identified. I'm just illustrating them in this passage. If you look at this passage, what comes to you as challenging language features that you would imagine would be challenging for kids, 4th to 8th grade particularly. The first thing people immediately identify is academic vocabulary. And we have had interventions focused on teaching individual words, but the teachers we talked to told us, even when I teach all these words from a text, my kids still don't understand what the text is about. So the goal was to think about, okay, beyond vocabulary, what might be challenging for kids? And these are the additional ones we've identified. Connecting ideas. Moreover, do all kids understand all these connectives? Complex words, even these nominalizations, they might understand concentrate and they might not understand concentration. Complex syntax that is expected. The writer's viewpoint, these kinds of stance markers or markers that qualify an assertion, right? It's very different to say extremely likely than to say extremely unlikely, and that would change the meaning of the sentence. And tracking ideas. This is very common in academic text where you say this problem, and this actually refers to a very complex idea that it's all encapsulated in this little phrase. And we hypothesized kids might have trouble with all these features that are so common in academic texts. What happens is if you open any academic text, it's very likely that you will find many of these features across content areas. And so this is what we call CALs. And what is quite interesting is that the academic discourse in Spanish features very similar language challenges, right? You see very similar, the instrument itself was adapted a little bit, but the components are very isomorphic with English, and the same with Portuguese. And so that you can see how the construct got translated, adapted, redefined, and then the instrument was developed from scratch actually in both places. So these are the different domains that we include in the CALs, and we can go back to that if people are interested in that. But let me give you an example. This is a simple instrument that we constructed. And here, for example, you see one item where kids were tested about on the understanding of in contrast. And I got to assessment because we were working in a project with Catherine, and we wanted to study adolescents' language, and I wanted to interview kids and talk to kids and record kids, and schools told us, well, you can do that, but you have to come and you have 45 minutes. And so that's what led us into this assessment that I was so skeptical about. So we tested every single item with so many kids and so many teachers. And so here we were testing the understanding of in contrast. So what you will see here in the next slide is the percent of kids who understood in contrast, who answered this item correctly. So just take a guess perhaps for the 8th graders. What's the proportion of 8th graders you think would know in contrast? These are kids in the US. And so this is what we found. And I have to say, every time I look at these numbers, I surprised myself again and again to think that these are words that kids encounter in school since 4th grade, and by 8th grade, actually they think they know them. If you ask them, do you know in contrast, they will tell you, oh yes, of course. But when you test them a little bit more, they don't understand, and they don't use or understand them in text. And this has been parallel in parallel results in Spanish and in Portuguese. But beyond those average by grade, what is quite interesting and quite challenging for pedagogy is that inside the classrooms, you see enormous variability. So these are very non-standard graphs, and each bar is a kid. So you can imagine these are kids sitting elbow to elbow in a classroom with very different language skills. So if you think about promoting reading and writing in school, and if you think about discussion-based approaches, then how do you manage that so that these high kids are not dominating the entire discussion or the entire learning opportunity, that all the learning opportunities? This is quite a challenge, and this is exactly what I think Beatrice and Ale will talk about in their interventions. But remember that the question was whether these individual differences would predict reading comprehension. In a sense, you know, if kids don't understand the language, is obvious that they will not understand the text. But what was quite interesting is to see that even in 6th grade and the 8th grade graphs look very similar. Sorry? Oh, I think there's an audio. Okay.
Perhaps people could, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's
Mute.
just a mic. Yeah, I think it's just a mic issue. So the individual differences were striking. And so the interesting question was, would this predict reading comprehension? And this is precisely what we have found now with thousands of kids in English, in Spanish, in Portuguese, that even when you are accounting for word recognition skills, even when you're accounting for vocabulary, these skills are quite predictive of reading comprehension. And so that opens a space to think about supporting and generating new interventions informed by this. We have by now, as I was telling you, tested kids in Chile, Peru, Colombia, Mexico, Brazil, and in the US also dual language learners. And so this appeared to be promising to design these interventions. And I'll share a couple of implications for practice, but I will let actually Beatrice and Ale talk much more about that. In the US and led by Catherine Snow, we actually implemented a discussion-based approach, the word generation in this project that is catalyzing comprehension through discussion and debate. And the idea was that through discussions and debates about texts that were framed around very engaging questions for kids, that would improve all this set of language skills and social perspective taking and argumentation, and that would improve reading to learn outcomes. This was in grades 4 through 8, mid-adolescence. And actually we found that to be the case with positive findings in understanding how better to support kids' language to read, to learn, right? But let me just start with one reflection and one challenge, I think, for all of us, which is that even when we do these discussion approaches, even when we have the best intentions to promote kids' language skills, voices, students' voices are not often equally distributed in classrooms. You know, it tends to be the case that the kid with more language, school relevant language skills, because all kids have language skills, but some, you know, for some kids, as my student Mariam David says, for some kids, the text in school sound like the conversations they have at home, but for many, they don't. And so what happens is that the voices are not equally distributed and the different voices are not always equally welcome. And I just want you to read this for 30 seconds, because I want to very clearly emphasize that this is not what we mean by CALS. What you have here is a student who is asking a question in non-standard English, right? And the teacher is correcting that before attending to the kid's meaning, right? By the end, the student doesn't ask the question anymore, right? Is that clear to people? And so what is happening here in this very minimal interaction is that the kid is being silenced in the effort of the teacher to promote language, right? And this is exactly what we don't want. Now, please note that the teacher here is the researcher in this article. This can happen to all of us. This is challenging, and with the best intentions, we could all fall into that trap. So I just want to end by saying that we need to value and welcome home languages, and we need to focus on students' meanings first. and we need to grant all students the right to speak, and in so doing, then expanding the language resources. And this is not an easy task. And so what I will ask Beatrice now is, in this effort that we need to support teachers to both affirm and amplify the language resources that kids bring and need to learn, how do we do that, right? It's not an easy challenge. And even when we know CALs are important, there are striking individual differences. They predict not only reading comprehension, we have data on predicting writing also. And now we know, with the work that we did with Catherine, that these language skills can be improved, right? But how do we do that? Which types of supports can help teachers in supporting their students in practices that are both affirming and amplifying students' voices, and in practices that support not only language, which is at the end the medium for learning, but in practices that support content area learning while expanding the language resources. And so, Beatrice, you've worked on history and language, and so I'm looking forward to hearing your answer to this complex challenge.
Thank you, Paola. It's always a pleasure to listen to you. And while I was listening, I was thinking, oh, I should have put this content in my presentation, but I will do what I can here with this English. So I will try to, let me put it here. Just a minute. Can you see it? Yeah?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes.
So thank you for the invitation. First of all, I'd like to thank this invitation. And it's always a pleasure to be together here in ProLayer. It's a very nice reunion of people that have the same challenges and is very, very friendly, share solutions. And this is very important in our field. And I'd like to give a special thanks for my mentor and partner, Anna Teberowski. I'm not sure she could come here. She wanted to, but I think the time difference, perhaps she's not here. But I've learned a lot with her during my whole professional life. And many of what I'm going to say here has the connection with all her research. I want to express the pleasure that has been the opportunity to collaborate, learn, and discuss with Paola during the last 5 years. And my gratitude for my team that is made of nice and bright people that don't measure efforts to contribute to public education in Brazil. So this is a team work that I'm just representing them here. So, Aprender a Estudar Textos is an in-service professional development program for 4th and 5th grade teachers. We leverage pedagogical theory as a lens through which to address the challenges of reading comprehension beyond the early literacy years. Just what Paola was explaining here, we try to give some lens through pedagogical knowledge for teachers to improve their practice. We aim to enhance students' understanding of historical content and through developing their academic language skills. As Paola just mentioned, those are areas that go together. So we support teachers in planning and implementing language activities. I'd like to say that many projects bring up the content dimension as the main object of the in-service training process. What marks our approach is that we bring the pedagogical repertoire as the key to connect the practice language and in practice language and historical content. So we do so by analyzing, modeling, planning, enacting, and reflecting on interactions that facilitate reading comprehension. We do all this together with teachers to create a new framework for them to see how to work with children. A sustainable investment must prepare teachers to understand and have the tools to install a reflective routine on students' learning process and at the same time on professional development for the teachers that promote this reflective routine with students. Our slogan in our program says, make the text your strongest ally. Another way of framing this idea that moves our program is like Paola says, transform language into a tool rather than a barrier for understanding. For that to happen, there is an important articulation of areas we must put in place. In our view, any educational training process must consider that there is always a single objective but dual focus. This means that in our methodology, we pay simultaneously attention to children as learners and adults as learners. You must be thinking, that's obvious. Yes, that's obvious. But the challenge is to consider it intrinsically, not only as part of a narrative or a justification of a program. Our bet is that a methodology that considers explicitly this dual process in practice can get to better results with student comprehension. But this decision brings consequences in the way to structure a training process. It impacts on how to select and organize the content and how to use the time. That is a very limited resource. We have always to think about this. We have very short time to make the training process with teachers, so we have to choose. We always have to have more to teach, share, and explain than what the schedules allows us. And if we give special place to practical implementation, decisions around the use of time are even more challenging. Usually we use to give teachers the explanation, the content. We explain how they have to work. So this takes time, but less time than if you embed the practical training for them to do and come back and reflect and learn and go, and it's this go and forward and backward that makes the difference. So to make it more concrete, let's begin taking a quick view on some decisions focused on children's perspective. Which materials should we use as a base for a learning process program? In our case, we decided to use the textbooks that are distributed by the government as reading materials because that is the material we have available at schools in Brazil. So we use the normal textbooks that any school have. We don't prepare a special material for the program. To structure an intervention that aims to improve children's learning, we need to identify the stage students were in the reading comprehension skills. For that, we decided to use CAUS, as Paola just explained it, developed by her team. And with this instrument, it brings the possibility to define a baseline and guide the intervention. As you can see in the image here, each question that is present in the CAUS instrument is connected with real challenges that apparently the simple texts that children have access to have. So this information we could capture via CAUS. The information we could capture via CAUS was extremely important to open teachers' eyes about the difficulty children faces in their routine in history classes. Teachers become at the same time surprised and intrigued when they understand how difficult the normal texts that are in the textbooks at schools are. So access to information and knowledge embedded in the data and in practical situations makes a huge difference in teacher training development. Teachers gradually feel invited to explore and unravel the elements of the learning process. Once we defined the material we would use with children and had a diagnosis, we arrived to a new type of question. What kind of activities should we promote to facilitate children learning? Working together with Teberowski, as I mentioned, we could learn about the tools she was creating to facilitate children to dive into the texts. Teberoski redesigned an ancient practice called Kola and Komata that has proved very useful to improve children's and teachers' comprehension through visualization and manipulation of language. Those strategies become tools for teachers and students to organize more concretely the content. So this is a strategy we bring up to teachers that reorganize the text, making connections through the sentence and the meaning of the text. And that helps a lot. So it's the chance to manipulate and to visualize the language and the content at the same time. Another strategy we use in the same vision is to invite students to a concrete manipulation of words. This strategy provokes a context in which they can discuss and try different combinations to get to a shared comprehension of the meaning of the text. Just what Paola was saying. So it's not only the case of reading and discussing isolated words, but it's to put in the hand of the children the possibility of discussion mediated by language. And through these activities, they can get closer to the comprehension of the meaning of the content, the historical content of the text. And another very important dimension of this work is to enhance children immersion on the language of the texts and incentivize teachers to use the literate discourse. For that to happen, teachers are invited to incorporate discussions not only on what the text says, but also on how it says it. The students have the right to participate in conversations that bring the literate discourse to the center. Soon in the process, teachers start to understand that the discussion on how the text says the content is also a dimension that has to be planned and has to be explicitly worked. Understanding that the challenge now is to learn through texts and not anymore the basics of the early literacy opens a wide path to review the form that history classes takes place. Texts are tools to learn about specific content and have specific language characteristics that has to be part of the day-by-day activities. To put all I've been saying together, there is a need of organizing it in a practical proposal. From the student point of view, how can we organize practically from the student point of view? How can we connect different tasks with demand in order to enhance comprehension? We use again Teberoski's concept of sequences of interdependent activities. In Spanish, it's called tareas encadenadas, which I think explains better than in English, to structure the teacher's planification. So the logic that guides this construct is to offer, on a recurring basis, the chance to experience a sequence of activities that will invite children to comprehend deeply the content of the text. While structuring the chain of activities, it's also important to pay attention to the balance between input and output, so we can really follow the students' learning process. This is very important to evitate what Paola just brought in that last dialogue she presented. So if we don't have the path of the appropriation of children, the output, if in the sequence of activities you don't think about how to give information and get back what they are producing, they are understanding, and they are learning, we are not going to get where we want, because we need to make this balance between, and this construct Anna developed is very important to help teachers to organize the process with children. So if we want all this with children to have this kind of experience I just mentioned before, what knowledge and skills we have to develop in adults to incorporate all this in their pedagogical practice. So let's focus a little bit in adults as learners. All we said before looks great. It's beautiful to see that we can do all that with children, with kids, but it's not simple. It's not simple to incorporate those practices, especially for teachers that have a a weak pre-service education. In some contexts, this kind of approach we are proposing can bring even challenges for the teachers as readers. We can't forget that. So we have a dual challenge here, which is the teacher is learning a lot of things about her profession, but at the same time, sometimes they are learning as readers also. But independently of their own capacity with text, each of the circles here in this image, in this graphic, represent different contents that takes place in the teacher's action, always. They are always present. So a teacher training process must consider those dimensions. The knowledge of teaching and learning in language and in history, the knowledge of how to create productive learning situations. And beyond that, the linkages among each of those parts. It's totally different to organize a course presenting theory and examples of practice than a process embedded in their real practice. In the architecture of this formative process, we encourage teachers to proactively transform their practice through the program rather than wait until the end to begin trying out different strategies. It's everything at the same time. They are learning and putting in practice and coming back and reflecting on the practice. For that to happen, our methodology is structured in cycles in which we study the text from the point of view of those three dimensions: the historical dimension, the language dimension, and the classroom activities implementation. During 1 year, we model their pedagogical practice. We can work around 8 to 10 texts through 1 year. And we believe that the opportunity to redo, this is very important, for different times, the same framework. We change the text, but we maintain this cycle of tareas encadenadas, I would say, and we create a process of appropriation that gradually can be incorporated by teachers, and they will get more autonomy in using this as a framework that they are appropriated in. So we aim that they can use this framework in different texts and different contexts. What kind of support we provide for the teachers? Since 2015, we are developing content and materials for teachers. It's a long time working in the same project to get to this point. During 2020, with the pandemic, we had to change our proposals of intervention, and we take the advantage, and we developed a platform that mirrors the structure of formative process. We've been working on pilots. The trails we suggest there for the teachers in the platform models planning as a process and anticipates what will be done. In the platform also, we invite teachers to deep in the content. So there they can find information about historical, linguistical, and pedagogical content. And the platform is a resource that supports the training during the process, and later on it will become a reference for teachers for future autonomous action. The training process is designed to take only 1 year. So automatically, we had to deal with the question, how can we support teachers to continue working in this framework after the training program finishes? As I mentioned, during one school calendar year, we can work in cycles, modeling pedagogical action. For that, we use one of the most used textbooks in Brazil to model the way we are proposing that the situations in classroom can happen. But in real life, they will face many different texts and subjects. How can we help them besides the diversity of tests? And we also know that in general, a Brazilian teacher has limits of time, and they have a very complicated work conditions. So they are not in the best condition to have the time to plan, to organize, to prepare what they're going to work with children. The solution we find was to develop a tool to help them analyze any text they want to study with children later on. So this tool, I don't know if I click here, can you see that moving? So this is a tool. This is a tool that analyzes the text. They put the text inside there, and the tool analyzes the text, providing a format that allows visualization, annotation, identifies vocabulary, and organize categories that help teachers plan. This was a tool developed aiming their autonomy and a more permanent support. So during 1 year, we work with specific texts, we model, but later on, they have to have go alone by their work. So with this tool, we aim to help them to have the chance to continue analyzing texts to inform their planning, the way they plan their activities with the children. In the training process and consequently in the platform, so the platform is a mirror of the training process, we focus in why and how to plan and realize activities. Those are the 4 steps we work with teachers during the process, and we present why we are working with the modular texts in the formative sessions. Going through these steps, teachers experience diving into the text, and they get the support to invite students to do the same, to dive into the text. The recurrent path we propose is first study the text, then we invite them to connect with the learning objectives they have and the curriculum, identify the specific challenge for understanding and preparing the activities that will take place for each text. These steps organize the chain of activities in order to invite children to a deep comprehension. So this is a synthesis of the way we structure our training methodology in order to impact children learning in a sustainable basis. And after many years testing and experience in small scale, due to the partnership with Paolo Uchelli and funded by the Lemon Brazil Foundation, the Lemon Brazil Research Fund, we implemented in 2020 the methodology in a public educational system in Brazil, Caieiras. We now are analyzing the data we collected. Because of the pandemic, we had to modify and adapt the methodology. So we couldn't get the quantitative data that we were expecting. But in the other hand, we could collect a significant qualitative data that indicates promising results. We couldn't get the quantitative data, and now during 2020, we got the qualitative data. This current year, we are working in a quasi-experimental study funded by Tinker Foundation, and our expectation is that in 2023, we will have an evidence-based analysis of the process with quantitative and qualitative information. I just brought here to wrap up these tables that are published in the article we published with in the magazine Pensamento Educativo, organized by Alejandra, here our colleague here. And here in the QR code, you can access the article. And here we show in a case study how this methodology impacts the experience in cycles, how it impacts the promotion of comprehension, studying the text, aiming the comprehensions of students, and the discussion in the classroom. I'm not gonna, I think my time is over, so I'm just gonna wrap up here. So, Aprender a Estudar Textos have this twofold goal: address the literacy needs of students in partner districts, so you can see the numbers here, and also iterate and build on a scalable methodology that equips teachers with the necessary knowledge and tools for professional judgment and action in the ever-changing context of the public schools. So I will finish here, and then we can continue in the debate. I just want to mention that we have a partner here called LAPIS, which is the Laboratory of Economics of USP, that works together here, dealing with all these data that we collect, and they are the partner in this quasi-experimental study we are just beginning this year in a city called Várzea Paulista here near Sao Paulo. So sorry about the time, I went through, but I am Brazilian. I have now to make my question to Alejandra. So Alejandra, we use the same, wait just a minute. We use the same framework, but there are methodological differences due to the specific fields, history and science. Can you highlight some of the specificities you identify for science that are different for the other fields? So the disciplinary dimension, can you talk, I'm sure you're gonna present in science, and I think we can reflect a little bit on this question about how the general academic language approach is useful, but we have to embed that in the disciplinary dimension, and what's the difference in projects with this, depending on the field they are immersed. So now you have the chance to.
Thank you very much, Beatrice, for the question. I think that as linguistic, I love your platform for analyzing text. I think this is a dream also for Spanish. And also, I want to thank you very much for the invitation to share today with the ProLayer community the CLICK project, an intervention for promoting primary students' science practices by expanding their language and science knowledge. And this project is built around the CALS framework presented by Paola for Spanish. The first idea is that science instruction has shifted from teaching content to authentic scientific practice. Indeed, three-dimensional science learning posits that scientific practices are constructed in the interrelation between core ideas, cross-cutting concept, and a specific language. And I think that this idea is important for the Beatrice question, because here is very important the core idea for the science learning. Some interventions have shown how research-based pedagogy for science teaching and evidence-based pedagogy for effective writing instruction benefit the construction of scientific explanation without explicit attention to language mastery. Numerous studies highlight the challenge involved in the linguistic resources provided to students for scientific genres. These resources facilitate the construction of technicality through disciplinary vocabulary and extended noun phrases, the development of evidence-based reasoning through causal patterns, and the projection of an objective epistemic voice, among others. Less research has explored the contribution of disciplinary and cross-disciplinary language to the quality of the scientific genre. Today, I want to develop 4 core ideas from the project CLICK, Conectando Ciencias y Lenguaje, that was carried out during 4 years in Santiago de Chile and involved more than 1,000 fourth graders. The first idea, curriculum matters. So we will ask the question how to sequence science and cross-disciplinary language learning of fourth graders for construction scientific explanation. An interdisciplinary team with experts in science, linguistics, press service, and in-service teacher worked first on designing the main mechanism of change and then on developing a learning sequence. What are the main mechanisms? The intervention is designed to improve science learning among fourth graders. And first, the focus of science teaching was shifted to scientific practices, specifically the use of model, experiments, and construction of explanations. Second, we incorporate reading and writing activities for science learning with different scaffolds. And third, throughout the learning sequence, there were increased opportunity to teach cross-disciplinary language in both science and literacy activities explicitly. How do we sequence learning? Year 1, our team developed the instructional activities and learning sequence. Year 2, we conduct a design-based research with 179 fourth graders and 3 teachers. The teacher and a student implemented the Unit 1. We analyzed class videos and sample of student notebooks during the evaluation phase. For phase 2, we refined the activities and learning sequence that will inform the activities for Unit 2. And at the end of Year 2, we arrive at an optimal instructional sequence. Here is our sequence. Each unit consists of 9 activities, which are organized in 3 phases. The first phase is the initial models and the building of disciplinary core ideas. The objective of this phase is to construct with students the disciplinary core ideas that will later enable them to explain the unit's scientific process. The first activity elicits initial multimodal models of the phenomenon to be explained. Draw the components that allow moving the forearm toward the arm and how they are connected. Label each of the components. Students then compare and discuss their initial model until they reach consensus. During activity 2, they watch a video of chicken wing dissection, the favor, and students take notes. Phase 1 concludes with the reading of expository science text. The second phase is the co-construction of scientific reasoning. The objective of this phase is to unpack the mechanisms that lead a student to grasp cause and effect in scientific phenomena. The first hands-on activity aims to enact scientific practices, either constructing a model in Unit 1 or doing an experiment in Unit 2, where a student made visible which agents produce the scientific phenomenon. The purpose is to support a student in moving from describing or listing components to constructing causal reasoning. In activity 5, students first fill in the blanks. Tasks establish causal relations with the concrete elements that build their model. Then they rewrite the conclusion using the disciplinary language. Phase 2 also concludes with the reading of multimodal explanatory text that consolidates what the students have learned about the causal mechanism. The third phase is the writing of the scientific genre. The objective of phase 3 was to provide a student with a scaffolding to write a scientific explanation with evidence in response to the question posed in the unit. Activity 7 introduces a student to decompose a scientific explanation into its discursive phases, phenomenon, claim, evidence, alongside the relevant lexical grammatical resources. Activity 8 adds another dimension. A student wrote a scientific explanation with scaffolding to construct a causal affirmation that incorporates evidence. In activity 9, they revised and rewrote their scientific explanation so they could improve their explanation both conceptually and linguistically. The unit concluded with the task of producing the scientific explanation without scaffolding and included a meta-linguistic reflection about the changes between the initial explanation and the one written at the end. This unit is 4-5-week intervention with duration of 12 hours. And in the learning sequence, we first maximize scaffolded access to cross-disciplinary and disciplinary language during practical science activities. Second, we provide verbal and visual scaffold during reading to promote understanding, cross-cutting concept and core concept. And third, we promote unpack and repackage ideas during the writing of a school science exercise focused on language. CLICK consists of 2 units. One deals with the arm movement and the second with the change in state of matters. Here we can observe, unsurprisingly, A student in year 1 made significant progress in all 5 distal outcomes. The largest effects were found for Spanish calls and science learning. However, these results show changes that cannot be attributed exclusively to the intervention since there is no comparison group. The second core idea is about student learning. During year 3 and 4, we conducted a quasi-experimental study to determine the effects of Project Click. We asked about what learning in science and language did Click students obtain in comparison to a non-intervention group. Here we can observe student gains in science in 3 groups with no intervention, half intervention, and whole intervention, and the group with the whole intervention made more progress in their science scores with a larger effect size. All 3 groups advanced significantly also in their Spanish calls proficiency with a larger effect size for the group with the whole intervention. In year 4, we replicate with a new group of students. Here we again observe that the students who participate in Project Click achieve higher science learning with larger effect size. In Spanish calls, both groups reach almost the same final proficiency with a slightly larger effect size for the Click project group. The third core idea, implementation is essential. To understand this idea, we are going to ask, what is the relation between dosage and learning in science and language in year 4? We measure the dosage by the percentage of activities completed in each student's notebook. We can observe to the right, especially 2 schools with the highest dosage. However, at the top, we see that the students in orange achieve higher science learning, especially those in school 1. At the bottom, although they implemented also all of the curriculum, they did not perform as well in science. Thus, curriculum is important, but interaction is also critical. A similar pattern is observed in language proficiency, although slightly lower, and now we are beginning to analyze the classroom interaction in school orange to understand better what is going on in this school. Finally, the 4th core idea is about language, microdevelopmental, taking into account that each student produce 4 explanations, one at the beginning and one at the end of each unit. We ask, how do the productive resources of the disciplinary and cross-disciplinary language grow through the 2 units? We have analyzed 10 language resources in the explanation written by the student. We can observe that the most of the resources are increasing, while of course self-mention and the contextualized language are decreasing, which is to be expected. The only resources growth model that doesn't have a statistically significant slope over time is that for scientific vocabulary. This is important. These results depend rather on the learning in each unit. We can conclude that as the learning unit progresses, the student appropriation of resources increases on average, making initial student groups more heterogeneous as the instruction goes on. We will now begin also to analyze the quality of these explanations. Here we can observe the 4 scientific explanations produced by a girl. Yes, this is in Spanish, but to understand better in a qualitative how is increasing the different repertoire and also the quality of the content. At the beginning, the girl writes, el antebrazo se mueve hacia el brazo, es que el antebrazo se mueve hacia atrás, y así es como el antebrazo se mueve al brazo. At the end of the first unit, the girl wrote, el antebrazo se mueve hacia el brazo, debido a que el antebrazo se mueve hacia el brazo, porque hay 2 músculos, el 1 y el 2, y cuando doblamos el músculo 1 se contrae y el 2 se relaja. Basado en el modelo del brazo, se comprueba que al enrollar la cinta, el cartón se junta con el otro cartón. At the beginning of the second unit, we can observe that the decrease the extension, also the content, because they doesn't have knowledge about this topic. Un material de estado sólido cambia a líquido porque debido a que se puede evaporar. And at the end of the unit 2, the girl wrote, una materia cambia de estado sólido a líquido debido a que el cuerpo A, que está a mayor temperatura, transfiere calor al cuerpo B, que está a menor temperatura. Basado en el experimento del derretimiento del hielo, se muestra que al entrar en contacto el hielo, menor temperatura, con el agua caliente, mayor temperatura, esta le transfiere calor al hielo, causando que cambiara de estado sólido a líquido. This is very important because this is 4th grade girl, and also in the low income context school, that also we are thinking what is low or vulnerable school. To conclude, I would like to read a reflection from the teacher from Orange School. I wasn't about kid copying exactly what I wanted and answering exactly what I was looking for. Rather, it was about giving this kid the opportunity to speak. And if she was wrong, it didn't matter. She had the opportunity to change what she says, and it's very good to have the opportunity to correct your mistake, as they might not to speak because they are afraid or ashamed of being wrong. I think that is what is going to make the children more well-rounded, more human, more participatory, able to express themselves. So I think my practice has changed too. Here are the acknowledgement to the different projects that have supported our research and also our team, both the team that developed the curriculum and also the team that actually are studying the explanation, the scientific explanation. And I want to express our deep gratitude to the many students and teachers who participate in this study. And this is our group, our team, Factoría Ideas. Gracias.
Thank you very much to Ale and to Beatrice and to Paola for these rich and extensive presentations. And I'm going to start the questions, but if people have questions, raise your hands and I will call on you in sequence. But as all three of you know, ProLier was developed primarily with a focus on early literacy development and policies and practices in the primary grades. And the work that you've talked about is about grade 4 and up, grade 4, grade 5, grade 6, and later. And it's very, I want to say, I think it's very important, and it also deals with groups of kids who are particularly vulnerable because they are in that age range, often at risk, even if they've done well in early literacy. But what would any of you suggest should be going on in kinder or in first grade to prepare children to do well on these tasks that we've discovered are important in fourth grade, and to reduce the heterogeneity of within classrooms in those later grades, anticipatorily rather than in a remedial or interventionist way? Paola, do you want to start?
I could start, although, Beatrice and Ale might have more interesting interventions actually, but I can share perhaps sort of a little bit of the research, and then Beatrice and Ale could talk about their pieces. Perhaps actually, let me try to share a couple of slides only so that we can do this very briefly. But the question, I think it's an essential question, because why wait until adolescence, right? If kids are having so much trouble, what can be some practices that can support kids from early on? And so if you read these three interactions, which ones would you think would be more supportive of kids' school relevant language development? If you had to pick from these three, which one would you say would be more supportive? And perhaps you can just write it in the chat, and we can say sort of 1, 2, 3 in the order. Which ones of these three do you think, assuming that these are ongoing conversations, right? Because basically from the research that Catherine actually has conducted from a long time, and Meredith Rowe, my colleague here, we actually know a lot about the kinds of language contexts that support kids in school relevant language development. And so there is this notion that is called extended talk, which is these conversations, right? Like the 1 and 2, many of you were choosing 1, but actually 2 might also be supportive in some ways. This one, the first one, much more directly related, but this extended talk has basically 2 characteristics. First, it continues for multiple turns. That's the extended part. But then it's about ideas, people, themes that go beyond what kids can see in the physical context of the interaction. And if you think about that, that connects, right, language in a text-like way that we know to be supportive for literacy later on. So let me just say that we had an amazing opportunity with Meredith Rowe, my colleague, to connect this research on extended talk and the CALS research, trying to think, well, is this extended talk, right, from early on, perhaps the kind of talk that would support school relevant language development? And she had an extensive longitudinal data set that she had collected in collaboration with Susan Golden Mayo and colleagues. And what we did is the kids who had been followed since age 30 months were tested at age 12 with the CALS. And so the hypothesis would be that kids who at 30 months had participated more often in extended talk, meaning narratives, explanations, pretend plays, would have higher CALS at age 12, 10 years later. That was sort of the hypothesis. And actually what we found, and let me just skip all this, was that indeed the kids who produced, actually not only the kids whose parents produced more extended talk were the same kids who themselves produced more extended talk. So of course, you know, that happens in the interaction, but it was particularly the kids who produced more narrative, explanation, or pretense, which are of course very minimal at 30 months, were the ones who 10 years later had higher CALS. And that's of course only a correlational study. There's no causal explanation, and there's no way in which we think if you missed that interaction at 30 months, there's nothing you can do later on. What happens is that it tends to be that what you can capture in a very small snapshot of parent-child interaction that early in life tends to be sort of an index of the kind of language environment that the kids grows up in their home, right? So this sort of extended dialogue, extended talk seems to be a particular, let me just stop sharing, a particularly helpful kind of talk. So it's not only talking, is what kind of talk are we exposing kids to? And this is not only at home when we are discussing books, when we are sharing narratives or pretend or explanations, but also in preschools, right? Where actually the moments of even informal interaction with kids, when we can support them with extended talk via this same narratives, explanations, pretend play, are essential to support their language learning. But this is, you know, from the research side, which is actually much easier than from the practice side. So I know Beatrice or Ale have also action research that they have on this topic.
If folks are interested in putting a question in the chat, I would invite you to, while Ale and Beatrice pick up on that invitation.
Oh, I can just make a quick comment that I agree with all Paola brought. And I think in a country like Brazil, and I think all Latin America, we have to influence that the educational policy understands that it's a path from 0 to 10 years old to get here where we are, the point we are discussing in this with these two projects. So what we try to do in our NGO, Laboratório de Educação, is that we have this vision and we try to share this vision. So we are working in Maranhão, which is a state in Brazil, in 5 cities and with the whole municipalities of the state, exactly working with families and in the preschool to bring up the necessity and the tools and the activities, sharing activities that have to take place in this in this early development of children. So it has to start at 0 years. So when you receive a baby, you have to start talking, and we have to share more the types of talk that can make a difference. Is that just what Paola brought? And I think if we show this for the families, they can understand, they can incorporate the value of certain type of conversation, and that will certainly have an impact, an influence in their forward scholarity. So I think it's also something that we have to insist in terms of changing the vision that is put in the political educational policy that goes in public systems.
Also, I want to add something. I think that it's very important to diversify the topics to be discussed with the kids, and this includes science, history topic, also other topics. And I think that is very important because we are talking about sociocultural language development, and perhaps it's more focused in relation oral and written, but I think that the different context is very, very important. For example, if we talk with a student about Vulcano, we will use a different language resources. And I think that the Netherlands groups have a very beautiful work on science topic with the kids, with pre-kindergarten children, for example, using mirrors. And I think that also is very important, the relation between input linguistic and output linguistic, the opportunity for the kids to express their ideas.
Thank you. So there are some great questions in the chat as well, but I'll turn to Ana Maria and let her pose her question first.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and all the members of the panel for very stimulating work. Actually, I apologize because I'm not really looking for an answer, but more expressing a concern, and it's a local concern. In Costa Rica, I believe we have a larger problem to help children in public schools to learn academic language because during all elementary school, now they do not use textbooks. About a decade ago, textbooks were replaced, but what we could say some loose photocopies, some short guides prepared by the ministry or teachers, and teachers' explanations. And they still have problems in learning the more academic subjects. Maybe, I don't know, as Catherine and Paola propose based on their research, we may have to develop teachers' extended talk to help children. It looks for me as a backward movement, but I don't see what else we could do. That was my concern.
Reactions from anyone? I think both Beatrice and Ale, in a sense, have an answer to that, right? Developing curricular supports or professional development, but I'll let them answer themselves.
Well, I think you are bringing up some visions that are around teacher context that I think you are right. They're kind of a substitution of the text, because the texts are traditional, they are bad, they are not a very important material. And then we move to something that it's even weaker than the text we have. So the lesson we did in our project I just presented is work with the text we have. It's not the best one, it's not a fantastic text, but it's the school textbooks that can provide information for children. So I think you are totally right in your concern. And I think that comes with some pedagogical discussion on the, how do you say, correntes, the groups of research, traditional and constructivist, and what other names you can give to that. And we are arriving to something that is really poor, because we are taking out of the pedagogical process the main references we should give to children. So I think your concern is totally right. It's a problem of balance, I think.
Oh, thank you very much, Beatrice. I appreciate it.
So there is a question in the chat from about going the other way, the implications of this kind of work. This is from Laura Nathans, to higher ed, implications for the college-age population, and to college level educators. What advice would you give for anybody in those groups?
I mean, I can perhaps comment on that with a personal experience, because my sister teaches at the university in Peru. And so when I shared this research with her, she actually started to teach in a different way without assuming that kids, because these are undergrads, right out of high school, would know all this language. And actually she was surprised to realize how much she had assumed the students would understand from, of course, the more complex university level text, right? So it might not be exactly the same pieces that we are sharing with adolescent kids, but this idea that you cannot take for granted that the language you are using even to explain a text will be known or understood in a precise way by all your students. I think it's actually quite important, more even now that universities also are opening, fortunately, to much more diverse populations. So we owe it to the students to support that transition into college with the language resources that will support their learning. So I don't have an exact, precise sort of intervention or answer, but I think it is an essential piece to think about the language. How do we support the writing and the reading, the language resources for reading and writing at the college level?
Thank you. Francis, do you want to pose your question?
Yeah, thank you so much. First, thank you all. This has been very informative and just a good experience. I just got off of final, so it's actually quite relaxing to have some intellectual conversation without the stress. I guess my question.
We're giving a test at the end, I have to tell you. We'll be giving you a test.
And we did a catch. No, so I guess there were a couple interesting, theoretical things in Paolo's introduction, and then even in the implementation. So to kind of direct it to Paolo to begin, I was wondering that you had a slide where we talked about how there are certain processes where there are indirect, pieces of information, like what other people think, reading comprehension, etc. And I guess I was wondering how distinct do we consider this like reading comprehension, the development of that skill from these other skills that are indirect? And because I guess I was wondering whether the insinuation was, well, if we're developing one, because there's this indirect link, I guess we're developing all. And I was wondering whether that was the case. On the implementation side, I guess my question was, we keep on using terms about like academic language, academic reading comprehension, etc. But I mean, functionally, these things are all super fluid, right? So it's not like you go to school and then you put on another hat and then you start talking very differently. And I guess I was wondering how we approach like thinking about these constructs like, academic language and reading comprehension, acknowledging that fluidity, despite the fact that, probably there is something substantively different. So those are my questions.
I guess I can take that, and I appreciate the question very much. I will actually start with the second question, because if you noticed, I've purposefully moved away from academic language to call it now analytical language. I don't know that the move is that helpful, but what I'm trying to avoid is precisely that categorical distinction that Catherine and I have been trying to fight since the very first paper we wrote on this topic. But it seems that the term academic language sort of triggers this categorical thinking into thinking that there's one way of talking at school and a very different one outside of school. And of course, just we know that not to be true. As we are, making these arguments, we're using all kinds of resources from everyday language. So I've moved to analytical language skills to think about sort of the informational, explanatory, argumentative text, trying precisely to avoid that. And I think that is one of the ways in which I worry this research could be counterproductive, when teachers assume that kids cannot use their own language to understand because they have to use only academic language. And that's absolutely counterproductive. All of us working in language learning with little kids all the way through adolescence know that to be impossible, actually, not only counterproductive, impossible, right? So it's only when kids use their own language, their home language, if it's a different language from school, their colloquial resources to understand new content. It's the only way that we can scaffold new content. I think it's beautifully illustrated in Alice's project, where they are not only supported by their home languages, but by drawing, right, a model of scientific explanations of the arm movement. They are grounded on a non-language activity. And then they are discussing that with their own language resources to try to grasp, to even understand what understanding means, right? We need to model for kids what understanding scientifically means. But that distinction is absolutely counterproductive. And if there's one thing I hope this research does not do, is to reinforce that, but to think about, well, as you teach some math skills that you don't learn outside of school, we have to be aware that there are some language pieces that we also need to support, but not as replacements, but as, continuous expansion of the language resources that we need. And I argue actually that we as teachers and as researchers also need to learn from kids' languages. I mean, in this very complex world, we better keep a little bit updated on the new language resources that kids have to offer, which should make the teaching more enjoyable, actually, but also because we all need to navigate multiple contexts beyond school, right? I'll address your first question very briefly, but I think, what happens when you read a text, and it doesn't matter if you read it or if you listen to a presentation, a scientific presentation, is sort of connected text in all its modalities, in a way combines all this, right? I mean, there are emotions that you need to understand in a historical text to understand perspective. There are multiple perspectives, not only in history and in narrative, but also in science. So in a way, all these different components, and argumentation, of course, in the scientific text. So all these different components are in a way intertwined when you are reading. And so I don't think it's a matter of making one explicit, but through discussion, you are scaffolding perhaps more one or another depending on the text or the topic, but these are all intertwined hidden processes. We know, for example, that little kids who discuss emotions with their parents more frequently tend to have a higher understanding of emotions, right? And so we have those links. I think in reading comprehension, it's all these processes together, though, that will help expand that understanding. I'm not sure that was your first question, but that's my answer.
So I'm gonna, we have formally three or four more minutes, and there are 3 or 4 questions in the chat about basically the same topic, which is the topic of equity, the challenge of pursuing these goals in classrooms with very different levels, with very heterogeneous groups of kids, some of whom will talk a lot and some of whom will not participate in the classroom discussion we know is so useful. When there are very large classrooms that make it hard to engage in the kind of thoughtful classroom talk that we know is useful. Could each of you just take 1 minute and address this issue of how severe a challenge equity is to achieving the goals we are all committed to?
For equity reasons, I'll let Beatrice and Alejandra speak now.
Yeah, I was going to suggest Beatrice start.
Okay. So this is the biggest challenge, and I think when we put in progress a program like the one I mentioned, and the one Alejandra is bringing up, we are all doing many things at the same time. So here we highlighted the dimension of the teacher preparation and the content for children. But while working all this, we have all the time to bring up this transversal knowledge, which is think about how to include all the children, how to look for them as intelligent people that have an answer. It's not there is a diversity among the answers that children can give, and we have to help teachers to be more accurate in the way of understanding what comes and trying to give it back so that everybody can improve. I think this is transversal. So we could talk about one session about the strategies to bring this up, but I think those strategies, they are embedded in the whole process of teacher preparation. And here in Brazil, they are always surprised when you organize a pedagogical situation that really includes the children's opinion, children's point of view. They are surprised. Sometimes they say, oh, but this girl that I didn't think she was following anything. And when we can organize a good situation, then they can see the children. If they can see the children, something starts there and we start to fight the inequity. It's a long path, but I think when we do this, we can create a new context that opens possibilities to fight this huge problem we have in all our systems.
Yes, for me, I think that today is very relevant to understand the different languages research that the students bring to the classroom. And I think that this is not only verbal, also multimodal, visual, and different registers. I agree with Francis that the registers are more fluid in the context for, yes, to express some idea. For this reason, I think that the focus for us is to understand what is the most important objective learning in different subject matter. And I think that post-pandemic also is brought the question, what is essential for each subject matter? And in this exercise, and also this was the exercise in our implementation, then to unpack the demands of language in order to scaffold different students conceptually and linguistically to address the learnings, but also for the reason that we really want that each student can express their voice.
Thank you all very much, and thanks to the audience. There are great resources that various people have put in chat, so I hope you will all copy those and make them available to your colleagues and students. And I want to thank Prolier for having organized this event and gotten such an interesting and varied audience to attend, and Beatrice and Alejandra and Paola for sharing your work with us and for demonstrating the value of collaboration across languages and across cultures. Thank you.
Gracias.